Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
It is my privilege to welcome all of you to the 13th Annual North Idaho College Public Forum End of the Year Review. This is the 13th year that we have been doing this program, and I am so happy to welcome to the program to help us look at 1984 three members of the Department of Political Science at Eastern Washington University. I've had members of that department before on this program, and it's been too long. We should have had them back before now. They're always very outstanding in discussing issues with us. I'm happy to welcome to the program, first of all, to my left, is Dr. Shane Mahoney, who is specializing in American politics. He also deals with the Soviet Union and particularly military aspects. Our second guest is Dr. Bob Harrell, who specializes in urban and state politics, also with some interest in national security issues and courses. And our third guest is Dr. Keith Quincy, who is in the field of American politics and American theory. He also deals with politics as it relates to economic issues and has some interest in Southeast Asia. With all of those specialties and expertise, I know that we can do a very fine job today in dealing with some of the things that happened in 1984. As I was coming to the program, I was trying to give some priority to what we should deal with, and I would suggest that maybe the biggest story in 1984 from the viewpoint of the United States was once again the presidential elections. Shall we take that and look at it from several perspectives? First of all, the margin of victory for President Reagan and the Republican Party in the presidential election. Also, it was the first time in history that a woman appeared on the national ticket of either of the major parties, in this case for the vice presidency of the Democratic Party. We've also been hearing a lot about whether or not this election is signaling a realignment of the two-party system in this country. I'm making this very general, and I want to give all three of you the opportunity to pursue that in whatever way that you wish. Dr. Quincy, let's start with you and let you give us your idea of what has happened in 1984.
Well, I tried to collect some data that would give some indication of changes. There were some exit polls by Gallup and ABC TV and Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times, etc. What Gallup found were some rather significant changes from 1976 to this election, 1984, in terms of people's party identification. And it's generally been the case that party identification is a rather stable sort of thing. And there are some dramatic changes here. In 1976, 47% of the people identified themselves as Democrats. In 1984, that fell to 39%. In 76, 23% identified themselves as Republicans. That has increased considerably now to 35%. Independents in 76 were 30%, and that's fallen to 26%. It appears that the independents and people who were polled went for Reagan and are changing their party affiliation from being a non-party to being party. Also, about 20% of the Democrats who had voted for Carter in 80 voted for Reagan in 84, and it appears that some of those have changed party affiliations. Again, this is an exit poll, and how stable this is and whether or not it'll hold up after later analysis is another thing, but I find it very interesting. There's also some changes in the support that Reagan got from different segments of the country. Geographically, the East Coast increased its vote over 1980 for Reagan by 12%. Southern whites increased it by 14%. Born-again Christians by 19%. Catholics, including Hispanics, which is a major minority, and had previously identified with the Democrats, increased their vote by 12% over 1980.
Some individuals might respond to that by saying that this is a vote for the president and his popularity. However, I know that as a political scientist you take it further than that, and you've also got some results of what happened in other races. Do you think that this very encouraging thing for the Republican Party goes beyond the presidential election, or is it limited to that?
No, I think it goes beyond the presidential election. If we look at congressional, gubernatorial, and state legislative elections in 1984, we find some instructive data. The congressional elections, the Republicans lost 9 seats in the House. And actually, if you go back and look at 1980, they had 192 seats in the 1984. They're down to 183. They held their seats and their majority in the Senate. But the interesting thing is the incumbency factor. If you look, for instance, the amount of money that went into PACs this year was an all-time high. It's like something close to $200 million was collected by PACs. They didn't spend all that money on candidates. Most was for their own advertising, etc. But about 50 million or so was spent on candidates. Almost all of that for incumbents. So when you look at the elections for the House or the Senate, the ability of incumbents to get reelected today is very, very high. However, if you look at those elections in which Republicans and Democrats were running not against an incumbent, but both were challengers, generally the Republican won. Now, if you then turn to the gubernatorial races where you don't have some of these problems, or to the state legislative races where you don't have these problems, you find that over the last 6-7 years, the Republicans have held fairly steady in their gubernatorial positions. But in the state legislative scene, in 1982, the Democrats controlled 33. Both houses of the state legislatures controlled 33 states. After the 84 elections, they control only 24. The Republicans picked up 4 new states that they control. And that would indicate, at least there, that at the local level, the Republicans are showing considerable strength.
Let me bring Dr. Harrell and Dr. Mahoney into this conversation. And even though these statistics are very impressive and do indicate that there are some changes, however, since President Reagan carried all the states in the country with the exception of one, oftentimes there will be coattails that will affect the congressional races and the gubernatorial races. That did not happen this time. So is that encouragement for the Democratic Party to say that they still have great strength, even though incumbency might be a factor? Dr. Harrell?
Well, I think it's too early to tell. It would seem to me that the 88 election is going to be very, very critical, as the Democrats in 88 don't have to run against Reagan and his popularity. But it seems to me that the Democratic Party, at least at the national level, has a major problem on its hands, so long as it insists on putting together tickets which reflect what we might call functional interest groups, as opposed to tickets that reflect either philosophical or certainly geographical balance. If you look at the ticket that they ran against Reagan this year, Mondale and Ferraro, they're both out of the same wing of the party. Not only are they out of the same philosophical wing of the party, but they're almost out of the same geographical area of the party. The Democratic Party at the national level has not elected anyone to the office of president without a Southerner on the ticket since, I think, the Civil War. They would have done better this last go-around, I'm convinced, had they had a Southerner on the ticket, had somebody like Hollings or Bumpers or someone from the South been on the ticket. And it seems to me, if you look at presidential elections since the Civil War, the Democrats have, I think the record will show, have had trouble winning except in unusual years. The election 1916, Teddy Roosevelt decides to run, so the Democrats, so Wilson wins even though otherwise he might not have. And in 32 you have a depression. 48 was unusual. In 60, Kennedy managed to create the sense of crisis, and in 76, you're coming off of Watergate. But in those, every ticket that is won, Democratic ticket that has won has had a Southerner on it. It's had some sort of geographical balance. And since '72, I think the National Democratic Party has played more to functional interest groups. And if anything's apparent from this last go-around, that won't work in electing a president.
Dr. Mahoney, you have a theory called the crisis theory, I believe, and you've been analyzing with us, too, about the realignment.
We, as you might expect, spent some time, Keith and Bob and I and our colleagues, talking about the recent election. And it occurred to me that the Democrats haven't really won the presidency since the turn of the century, except in a time of crisis, with the exception of Woodrow Wilson's election, which could be attributed to a split in the Republican Party. In many respects today, we are without a clearly defined national crisis. And I think that what that has done is allowed national politics to turn back to fundamental American cultural values. The emphasis on free economy, the emphasis on local political power, governmental decentralization, all of the things that the Reagan administration has, the national symbols that the Reagan administration has successfully utilized in winning a very impressive election. I think that this does not bode well for the Democrats in the foreseeable future, insofar as the Reagan administration is able to mobilize some very, very traditional kinds of American values. Or successive Republican candidates able to do the same thing. I would add this, however. One could argue, additionally, that there is an element of crisis in contemporary American politics, and that has to do with the economy and with the deficit. But to the extent that there is a crisis, it's the Republicans that have responded to it. Whether their response will be effective or not remains to be seen, but it's the Republicans that have responded to it. In a sense, the Democrats responded to the crisis of the American middle class in the Depression and the crisis of the nation during the Cold War period. But the contemporary Democrats have, as some of them recognize, have left the American middle class, and that, of course, is where the votes are, have left the American middle class out of focus with respect to their political platform and their voter appeal. And it's the Republicans that have been responding to the middle class dilemma.
Don't you think that response has been largely symbolic?
Well, that may be true. That may in fact be true. And if the Republicans are going to be successful in the future, they are of course going to have to solve some of these
You can make
problems.
an argument that the recession was turned around by a combination of Keynesian economics and the Federal Reserve Board's tight money policy, and the administration policies had absolutely nothing to do with it.
Well, yes, you could, but people also have pointed out that Roosevelt didn't cure the Depression. And that may be true, but the national perception was that the Democrats had in fact done something about it.
I think you have to distinguish between your thesis about appealing to really very salient American political values, and I think you have a very strong case there, and the issue about which party is delivering what material benefits to whom. I think if you looked at the data, in fact, the middle class has been in many ways shortchanged by the Reagan policies. There's been a major shift in the distribution of income in this country, and the middle class has been essentially had its income reduced rather dramatically by the Reagan administration. That doesn't alter that people may perceive that the Republicans are appealing to values that they can grasp and understand.
Isn't the Republican Party really wrestling with this right now between the supply side supporters in the party and also the New Right, and then the more moderate wing of the party? I want to mention that in relation to the Senate reorganization when Senator Dole won. And the more moderate wing of the party won almost all those positions. Aren't they debating where they're going in 86, 88,
I think they are,
and 90?
but there's also a major difference between the parties. And I think Professor Mahoney was pointing this out, that the Democrats in 68 and 72 almost destroyed through reforms their ability to control their political fate. Primaries, independent candidate organizations are now determining who's running for president. It's a free-for-all. It's very difficult for the Democratic Party leaders to get together and actually plan on doing something sensible, or even have a debate in which they could do something with it, as the Republicans are doing now. The Republicans can debate, and there are people who can do something in terms of
That's
moving
an
the party in a
observation that
particular
probably ought to
direction.
be added that comes out of this election, is what Professor Quincy here notes, and that is that I think we're becoming more sensitive, at least political leaders are becoming far more sensitive to the severe impact, the detrimental impact of primary elections on party organization and party strength. Walter Mondale clearly suffered from what he termed a long period of bloodletting with Hart prior to winning the nomination, and that did a lot to damage the unity and cohesion of the party. And it's interesting the extent to which we're now becoming more sensitive. There's more talk about trying to find other systems to nominate candidates that allow party to remain cohesive.
You've got the data on that, but isn't this the first election since '72 that the Democrats have attempted to deal with the rise in the primary selected delegate to the National Convention? Didn't that number drop a little bit this year?
The last figure I saw, that actually the number of delegates who were committed, selected and committed by the primaries is increased. And I think they tried to deal with it, but one of the things that party leaders in states had to face, in this state as many other states, is when they were handed down the regulations by the National Committee, which said that if you don't follow the regulations, we will not seat these people in the convention, that many of them had to either change state laws, state laws changed so that they could satisfy these. It was very, very difficult. The open access provision allowed very small groups to change the whole process. Many of the state party leaders simply said that, I'm tired of this. We can't, this is unworkable. Let's go to the primary. And just threw up their hands. The primaries increased dramatically in that period. And I don't know any state, maybe you know one, I don't know any state that's gotten rid of a primary once it's had it.
We only have 10 minutes left, and we have a lot to cover.
Sorry.
And I do want to bring one more issue here before going to international politics, because we have a lot of expertise here. Oftentimes what Professor Mahoney is talking about is that elections can be decided nationally upon a crisis, and if a crisis is created, let us suppose that the deficit running as high as it is, and the whole question of the tax structure and the balance of payments and so forth, if that is not addressed by both the Democrats and Republicans in a very serious way in the upcoming months and a couple of years that lie ahead, down the road to 1986, 88, and 90, we might be surprised which way there might be a realignment if there becomes another economic crisis as there was in 1929. Do you think that is the number one priority domestically that has to be addressed? And also, I'm saying in relation to that, the defense budget, and maybe Professor Mahoney wants to address that part of that in relation to the military in the Soviet Union. And Dr. Harrell, I know you have interest in the national security question.
Well, if you'd have had this election in '82, we talk about party alignment, but I believe that the economy probably does drive things to an enormous extent. What would have happened had you had the election in '82? I suspect that the Reagan administration might have lost had the Democrats at least come with a somewhat different kind of ticket. And in '88, if the deficit catches up, you talk to people out in the street and you tell them that in the last 4 years that there has been more debt incurred in this country than in the history of the nation up until this point, and jaws drop open. But that's the truth. That's the case. And if it does catch up, I'd agree with you, Tony. It seems to me that all the talk of party realignment could evaporate in a hurry.
I think there could be some Republicans are undertaking to deal with this problem in some rather dramatic ways. Tax reform. No one's ever done this in the last 30 years. They are going to try to cut government expenditures. These kinds of results, if they have a flat tax of some sort and allow for some kinds of few loopholes, etc., and it turns out that when all is said and done by '88, people find themselves much worse off. And they find the fact that some loopholes were left in and corporations still aren't paying their fair share. You can have some very angry people as a result of that. Furthermore, if the economy hasn't picked up and people have sacrificed, they've gone through all these changes, changed institutions, maybe you've had Social Security, Medicare is already being cut, already being proposed to be cut. If all these things occur and nothing dramatic in terms of improving the economy happens, I think that the Republicans are going to have a difficult time unless the Democrats are committed to self-destruct, as they have in the past, I think they have a difficult time winning. Now, Reagan's been very successful in getting people to believe that almost whatever he does, no matter what it is a success.
But the results are still out on that score. The economy.
Well, let me give you my cynical view of things. I think that the Republicans now are profiting from what appears to be a party realignment. But I would argue that there's a good amount of volatility in party orientation, and it's going to ultimately depend on who's able to solve some of these problems. Thus far, the Republicans have successfully manipulated traditional American values and symbols and used them to advantage in winning the recent election. That is going to evaporate, however, if it isn't matched by performance. And I think the Republicans are quite sensitive to that. From my perspective, however, the problems are not things that are really given to the capacity of our national government, both with respect to its structural characteristics and with respect to the nature of the problems. They're not things that can be quickly and easily solved. I think that as a nation, we're looking at a prolonged period of problems of this sort. The problem with the economy is not going to be solved easily. It is tied very much into the international system and the structure of international economic competition, international debt, resources availability, and that sort of thing. It's not clear that the federal government, even given the kind of party cohesion and organization and presidential leadership that might help, even if we were able to get that, it's not clear that we can solve these problems without a vast amount of international cooperation that we're not necessarily going to get.
Let's pursue that a little bit further, Professor Mahoney, in relation to the ending of talks with the Soviet Union, the arms reduction talks, and then what happened in the Middle East and Lebanon, and also in Central America and El Salvador and so forth. If we tie all this together, do you see, in relation to the economy, if we don't make some progress in those areas, such as reductions in expenditures, that those two are tied together, or is it going to create some international crisis militarily?
There are great pressures, of course, to help solve the debt problem, deficit problem in the United States by cutting into military spending. Unfortunately, however, military spending is not something that you can cut unilaterally and then simply tighten your belt, as we could conceivably, for example, cut entitlement programs and tighten our own belts. If you substantially cut military spending, you're going to weaken the nation and its capacity to influence events in the international system, and a very good case can be made, I think, that a much more dangerous world will emerge. So we don't have the option of cutting defense spending in the same way that we cut other things. There are consequences to cutting defense spending that don't exist in other areas. Now, the one bright light in that regard, though, is that the Soviet Union is experiencing some very serious domestic economic problems, just as the United States is. And it's interesting to note that the Soviets are coming back to talk about strategic arms limitation, strategic arms reduction, even though Pershing and cruise missiles are still in Western Europe. I think that that's because, incidentally, the Soviets didn't leave the table primarily because of those missiles. There were probably a variety of factors, none the least of which was a transition in leadership in the Soviet Union. That seems to be getting itself sorted out, and some people have moved into position now with an interest in the economy that are likely to influence things a little bit more favorably with respect to arms talks. We're likely to see movement toward an agreement. The unfortunate side of that, however, is that an agreement is probably not going to allow a substantial decrease in military spending. I can't conceive of an agreement that's going to save us a lot of money.
Dr. Harrell, would you agree with that?
Well, see, I don't think that cutting the defense budgets, Shane's, he's making the argument that there's a linkage between defense spending and defense capability. And I would quarrel with it. I don't think the linkage is necessarily there. There are a lot of pressures within our political process, pressures which make it easy to spend money on national defense. There are the pressures of American federalism. There are the pressures of interest group liberalism, as Ted Loewy calls it. There are enormous pressures which make it easy to spend money in national defense and difficult to spend it on other sorts of things. And I don't believe that there's a careful enough accounting for those pressures and what those pressures what those pressures cost. I was talking to a fellow up in the Congressional Research Service not long ago about this very same question, and I asked him, I said, when you people study the defense budget, do you take a look at the amount of money that might be going into the defense sector simply because the pressures are there? Every state wants its fair share. All the services want their fair share. And there's an entire industry that's been fabricated out of this since World War II. And he says, that's true, but we don't do it, and it's a very, very difficult question. We don't know how to do it.
You see, I think
that's the correlation.
I'd like to add to this. It's interesting that we're talking about, and this feeds right into Bob's observation, we're talking about almost exclusively expenditures on strategic weaponry. I think Professor Mahoney and I are in agreement that, in fact, where the money should be going, it would be a lot more expensive than we're looking at right now, should be going to conventional forces. The Russians spend enormous amounts, not only on strategic weaponry, but in conventional forces. If we're going to talk about getting involved in the world and being prepared for emergencies and being able to prevent brush fires from really blazing up, you need adequate conventional forces.
I'm just sorry to interrupt, but we're out of time. I wish we just got started. We'll have to have you back, and I promise to do that at a later time. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had as our guests Professors Keith Quincy, Shane Mahoney, and Bob Harrell from Eastern Washington University, and you can see they're most informed and articulate, and I promise you we'll have them back at a later date. I thank you, gentlemen, for being so informative about some of the things that happened in 1984 and what we may be facing down the road in 85 and other years. Thank you again very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please be with us again next week at the same time, and have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.